The only thing that we're missing is a state. So tell us, dear world, why don't we have a state? That was the idea.
Dr. Ziad Asali, I'm so delighted to welcome you to AEI for this conversation about the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. You are the president and the founder of the American Task Force for Palestine, and so a perfect person with whom to discuss this. In some ways, what's so incredible is how little has changed in the 50 years since the Six-Day War. How do you see it?
Well, the Arabic word for 1967 war defeat was Naksa, which is a setback, as compared to the catastrophe of 1948, which was acknowledged to be Nakba, catastrophe. So this is the reaction of governments and people at the time. This is a setback, we'll get over it. Things will improve. It's been a long march not to make any move forward. That is the meaning of the annual 50-year commemoration of really a huge catastrophe for the Palestinian cause and for the Arabs. It has not been dealt with as a problem to solve, but it has been a source of lamentation.
That's a fascinating difference, really. Right. It is not. It has not been. In some ways, it has not been a call to action, or if it's been a call to action, it's not been more than that. It's been a lamentation.
It has been a lamentation. I have to make one exception. It's the only meaningful exception. The only leader, and hence the country that took it seriously, was Egypt.
Let's talk about 67 itself. You wrote a wonderful piece about your attitude towards it as a young man in Beirut. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was finishing up my medical school, and we were all kind of, everybody was excited. We were waiting what's going to happen in a few days. It's going to be, a huge war, and we'll reclaim back the land of Palestine and redress the grievance of history. Across the table from me, at the dinner table, was a professor of surgery, a highly respected person in our circles as a professor and as a man. And so we were talking, and I was telling him how, we're going to now go back and win and stuff. He said, look, what makes you think that you're going to win? I started counting to him. A bunch were adding to this conversation. The Syrians have so many tanks and so many airplanes, and the Egyptians have so many, and everybody has so many, and we're ready. And he said, look, I'm not sure as much as you are that anything like this will happen. All I know, I was born in Haifa, lived in Haifa, was driven out in 48, and could not make my way back, and I've been moving from one city to the other since then. Now I'm here and I'm doing fine. He was a professor and successful surgeon, and I just don't want to be driven away again. So I was upset. What are you talking about? What do you mean of defeat, and what kind of an attitude? I was not polite to my professor. To my dying day, I will regret how insensitive I was, and unwise to the extreme, of course. I had occasions to apologize to him in person and in writing, like the piece that you said. Later on, when I came to this country and started working on the Palestinian issue, I could see, there are compromises to be made, realities to be faced. We have to adjust ourselves to reality, not to our own ideology. So I started, believing in things that are, I'd like to think, realistic, consistent with everybody's dignity, but realizing there is a fact of life that's called Israel, and we must start out by accepting that. We can talk about it, but not accept it, and that will be, the standard conversation, discourse, or we can speak up publicly. So young people in this country started focusing on me saying, "What is this guy? What is he doing? You know, making all these concessions." And,
doesn't understand.
Yeah,
He's a
doesn't
defeatist.
understand. Yeah, whoa. You know, he doesn't know there is a revolution going on. That is when I wrote that piece, 40 years after the fact. The 10 following years were not more merciful in having people understand that, you know, there are two stories and there's only one piece of land, and you have to find a way for a future built on a new narrative rather than the prevailing narratives. We understand the previous narrative and commitment, but we have to carve out a new narrative for both.
So it is interesting to look at how the Middle East has evolved since that time. As you say, in 1967, the Arabs had a pretense of strength. The reclamation of all of the land that was to be divided between Israel and the Palestinians by the United Nations, the annihilation of the Jewish state. This was shown to be a complete lie by the Six-Day War, and so quickly, and since then, as you say, the Arab world has changed. Sadat was the first, but I would say that over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a further transformation in the Arab world. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. One real successful story in U.S. Arab relations and Israel-Arab relations has been Jordan. And similarly, I think that applies to Egypt, you know, since then, is that this is it. This is the last war. We're going to have to find a way to live together and accommodate and call for a compromise. The call for compromise was on putting some real commitment behind the two-state solution. I think right now, the Arabs in general, but the collectivity of the Arabs submitted an initiative early in this century to call for an end of hostilities on the basis of a two-state solution, which essentially normalizes Israel in the Middle East to all of the Arabs and makes them relinquish the historic claims in order to get a state of Palestine independent. That still is the only formula that any serious people talk about if they want to have an end of conflict. Look, first off, I want to give some credit to the Arabs that not enough Palestinians do. They have actually supported the Palestinian cause, so to speak, before 48 and after 48, and made sacrifices and accommodated refugees and etc., etc. They could not deliver. It's a question of commitment and power. You know, they could not deliver. They did not deliver. That part of their contribution is not sufficiently recognized by the people who were the recipients of that generosity. So this is in terms of sacrifices on many lines. So that has to be said. On the other hand, there's the issue of fatigue. How much do you go on, you know, supporting a cause that does not seem real anymore? You know, fighting Israel forever, this is nonsense. So they made that accommodation.
But of course, what was interesting was that the Arabs had always been willing previously to stand on principle at the expense of the Palestinian people, if you want to say.
Yes.
But one thing that I wonder is whether the Palestinians have evolved as much.
The Palestinians have been victims of many things. One of them is the fact that they never had the ability to bring about the cause that they said they were fighting for. We want to regain Palestine. Well, nobody told them realistically, you don't have the power to do that. They depended on others to do it, till others got tired of fighting and not being able to deliver. The leadership, consistently from pre-1948 to the present time, have not really leveled with the people. Like, look, we can't do this. Let us, you know, move on a different path. In 1988, the PLO, in Arab League meeting, accepted the two-state solutions, which was a huge step forward. The problem that we have lived with since then is that, yes, you accepted it, and you continued to preach otherwise. There was a disconnect between the reality of governance in the Palestinian territories after '93 and the discourse. The discourse continued to be belligerent and, Palestine. So the public has received confusing dual messages, and that continues up till now. It is much more of a source of legitimacy with the Palestinian people, patriotic commitment and manhood is to speak about, liberating all Palestine and not giving up anything, and get applause from all kinds of authorities, while talking seriously about, okay, how do we do this compromise? How do we make it work? Was limited to the people who were running the show.
And not even them, to a certain extent.
Let me say something that I will pay for. But the new privileges of ruling under occupation, it was under occupation, there's no question about it. There were constraints initially by direct Israeli army presence in the Palestinian territories, and gradually by surrogate power. But within these, there was a Palestinian structure that was being built up. It delivered several things to the Palestinians. Eventually, the absence of direct presence of the Israeli army, but many other things. But the folks who were in charge were allowed to continue the belligerent talk, the discourse, to continue that. But at the same time, they understood the privileges that that class had, many privileges at many levels, which made the status quo to them more acceptable than it was for the rest of the people who continued to have, so many problems in their day-to-day lives. And it is this class that is called upon to negotiate. This particular status quo is not a plateau. It is a descending curve. Mm-hmm. The status quo of today is worse than the one we had in 1973 or 78 or yesterday.
So there's a certain complacency with the fate of the Palestinian people.
Yes, of course there is.
Among the Palestinian leaders. So this is an interesting question. I had a talk with Elliot Abrams on this topic. We had the same kind of a discussion as we are today. And I spent plenty of time in the West Bank prior to the first Intifada. One of the things, and prior to the return of Yasser Arafat and Fatah. Mm-hmm. And it is striking that, and I wonder if you share this impression, that the return of Fatah introduced a sense of Arab governance to the Palestinians that perhaps had not been present after 1967. There was an indigenous Palestinian leadership that flourished at that time that seems to have disappeared since Oslo. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yes, generally speaking, I was born in Palestine before the mandate. Mm-hmm. So I'm a legitimate refugee. I can make any compromise I want because I'm legitimate about this issue. But we grew up in Jordan. We were Jordanian citizens, right, under the Hashemites. I have to say that we did not consider it occupation. Growing up, sensing things like, okay, so the Jordanians have power, but the Palestinians were very much part of government. They were part of the army, they were part of the police, mm-hmm, they were part of the educated class that dominated institutions and the economy, etc. So it was a very organic process. Mm-hmm. And things have changed, of course, after Oslo, because almost 300 to 350 Palestinians came back from Tunis and other places, mm-hmm, and they took over the power
Yes.
So this is the mindset that they brought to a very interesting group of people, which is the Palestinians under the direct Israeli occupation after 67.
Mm-hmm.
These people could talk.
Right.
These people could converse, and they could develop an intifada, the first intifada where there was not a single weapon as far as I know. It was just organized resistance by a network of academics and intellectuals and, you know, activists.
It certainly began differently, yes.
It began anyway. So these people were not allowed to continue as is after the return of PLO from Tunis. These people were submerged into what the Palestinians up till now call the Tunisians, the power of, you know, the refugees who did the fighting outside. This is their claim. Why did we come back here? Because we fought. And so we are, you know, to be acknowledged. It is a source of tension. It is a source of tension up till now. And these people ended up with a lot of privileges. Therein lies one major lost opportunity. People always talk about lost opportunities for the Palestinians, that they could have a democracy that is functional and respectful of others without guns, without fighting, and to live by some standards that are agreeable. That's never been reclaimed, actually.
And now, you know, 50 years after the loss of again these lands, at least in the Palestinian narrative, are they on their way to reclaiming this? Are they on their way to a solution any more than in the last few years, in your estimation?
Not really. We have huge problems. We have an issue of governance. Right now, the Palestinians are split into two entities, both ideologically and geographically. Hamas and Fatah, PLO, PA, without distinct margins, because you have Hamas people in the West Bank and you have Fatah people in Gaza. But nevertheless, the power structure is divided along these two huge... In this system, there's not been any elections for the past 11 years. I have two remarks about this. One is whenever you listen to anybody in New York or the US in general and in Europe and other places, they are always calling for elections.
Yes.
In Namibia, in whatever, Kenya, they want elections.
Yes.
Everybody is pretty silent about Palestinian elections. It's convenient. Okay? It's just convenient,
absolutely,
as it is. And so you start sensing that something is changing when people start taking the idea of elections more seriously. Now, elections, if the people are not prepared to participate in the political process, is a farce. You know? So you need to open up the system. You need to have the opportunity to speak freely, have a judicial system that protects you as you speak, have a police enforcement that, you know, can apply the laws that exist, and have the right to form parties to compete. Now, none of that is really present now. These are the two structures that exist, Fatah and Hamas, and they don't do elections anymore. They're very happy. You know, they talk about doing internal elections, which is a conference.
And they blame each other and the Israelis.
Of course. You have to develop a system of accountability within the Palestinian body politic that would develop the kinds of leadership that would represent their people, and then, you know, open up all the other things that come up with after good governance. Improving the economy, improving the education, the standard of living, hospitals, schools, etc., etc. It has to be an organic process that develops out of the Palestinians themselves. Another opportunity that was missed that I want to discuss is this state and institution building program. You remember?
Yes, of course.
It was real. It was serious. we witnessed this. This was nothing that we advocated ourselves in this country more than this business of improving governance, and allowing the people to develop the ability to go to the world and say, look at us. We're doing things fine. We have good schools, good laws, good etc., and we're implementing. The only thing that we're missing is a state. So tell us, dear world, why don't we have a state? That was the idea. There were several years till the IMF and the World Bank, etc., gave the Palestinian leadership at the time a clean bill of health. These guys are doing things right. Accountability, all the stuff.
Then what happened?
It ended a while ago, 3-4 years ago.
And this is actually a very interesting question. The Palestinian cause became a cause in 1967. We can say that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was created before. We can say that for the Palestinian people, it was a cause. But for the world, it became a cause only in 1967. I think that's not an unfair statement. And in the eyes of many in the Middle East, Israel only really became the state that it now is in 1967. And I would say that that's true for the relationship with the United States. It's true for its image in the Middle East, which was really indelibly etched as a dominant, decisive power that was here to stay. Is that a fair?
It is, along with the other things that the Israelis managed to build over decades. They started building way before 1948 their institutions.
True.
There were a bunch of departments that were present
during the mandate.
During the mandate, that just became ministries in 1948, but they all existed. Education, health, whatever, defense, all existed.
And it's that education.
It is that. Key. So the other thing is that, of course, the leadership of the Jewish community in Palestine under the mandate was mostly a group of Europeans who are familiar with the way things are done in the world, in the West in general. So it was not a hardship for them to do this. It was, natural.
There was more of a democratic instinct. Okay, all right. So this happened. What would have happened? This is a horrible hypothetical question, but it is an interesting thing to talk about for a Palestinian. What would have happened if the Six-Day War had never happened? Where would the Palestinian people be?
There would have been, so many things would have happened. 67 was crucial. 67 is what defined the outcome of 48. Okay, 48, everybody was sensing, on the Arab side, was sensing, well, this is a score that we need to settle at some point in time.
Right.
Okay. Well, after 67, the immediate reaction of the Arab states, when they met in Khartoum, Sudan, a few months after that, was no, no, no. Basically, no, 3 no's, it's called.
Yes.
No compromise, no deals, etc. With time and reality itself imposed on everybody the thought that this is permanent. So how do we deal with it? It was easier to have the thought and talk among friends than to have it a subject of public discourse. Up to this moment, the finality of the presence and strength of Israel is not acknowledged publicly as, even some of the leadership would say. So there is this contention. But this is a major change in the appreciation of the presence of Israel. The Arabs automatically have taken this position, we want Palestine and the Palestinian leadership, and they continued that dialogue till the last decade, where the conversation started with the Saudi initiative, and then the Arab Spring.
Which there was no Arab Spring.
There was no Arab Spring
among the Palestinians.
It's 5 years ago. Now, I think we need to factor that in a serious way.
How?
The Arab Spring is an expression of dissatisfaction across the Arab world with governance. That's what it was about.
Of course.
People lived like, they knew
like
that
victims
individually
of the
they
state.
could excel and be smart and go to the West and manage fine. It's in that system that things were not working out. So it was a rebellion against the system. It had many implications, still does, and it's catastrophic in so many ways to many countries. This is destructive. But essentially, there is a need to adjust, everybody concluded, adjust the relation with Israel. This is combined with the emerging influence of Iran in the region, which, there's no sugarcoating this thing. The United States changed its position on Iran with time under the leadership of President Obama. Okay? Whom he called rational actor in his conversation with Jeff. Rational actor, while the Arabs need to get their act together. It was fine to get a nuclear deal. It wasn't fine to give Iran a carte blanche, military carte blanche, economic and socio-cultural intrusion in all the Arab countries around it. That is new. Why do I tie it up with the previous project? Is because the sense of threat by the Arabs has usually been directed against Israel for decades and decades. The reality, the recent reality, is that the real threat now is perceived to be Iran. And it's not Iran in Tehran, it's Iran in Aleppo. It's Iran in Sinai, Yemen. It's Iran in Libya now.
It's Iran in Gaza.
In Gaza, are you kidding? Of course. So there is a new variable that has nothing to do with Palestine per se, but it has to do with the sense of threat and insecurity by the Arabs, especially the Gulf people, who have, basically been interested in Palestine-Israel justice and religious issues, now to a sense of maybe we have shared enemies here with the Israelis. A shared enemy, that is Iran. So that brings up a new way of looking at things that are related to both Iran and Israel in the Gulf, and the conversation has already started. And I don't mean just started, amongst the elite.
Of course, it
is consequential.
What does that mean for the Palestinians?
Well, this is the question that I have to be at least clear as far as I can about how to get to it. There is no shortcut. There is no immediate deal to be made. Let's just be clear. In the context of visits or whatever, the Palestinians and the Israelis are not ready structurally, politically. The body politic of both is not ready for a deal now. So it's ready for a transition to a deal. Now, what were the three avenues to get to Palestine? One was the peace process, final status, and the other was build the infrastructure. Building the infrastructure.
Yes,
These were the two. A new and interesting element has been introduced now recently by the Arab Spring and the Iran issue, which is what is called outside in. So we're not talking about building it from top down. We're not talking only about from down up. Now we're talking also about a new factor, outside in, where the Arabs and the other forces in the Middle East, under an American umbrella, are looking to bring the joint, efforts, collective political efforts, in order to put this thing to bed under a new security regime in the region.
I want to ask you an exit question, but I want to ask you one important thing first, because anybody who cares about the future of Israeli security, of Palestinian security, of the Middle East, looks at the rise of the use of violence and terrorism among the Palestinians and the condoning, the comfort level with with terrorism that has risen over the last 50 years as a cause for concern. How do you see this?
Terrorism.
And it's not just Hamas.
Terrorism across the region is a subject, that needs several sessions for conversation. So we cannot isolate what's happening with the Palestinians, Hamas, from the wide regional implications as to the rise of political Islam and all these things. But on this issue of security and terror, the one thing that I mentioned, some transitional measures to be made. You cannot allow the Palestinians to go on living like this, subjected to external control from the Israelis and to internal control by a police, non-democratic regime, without any prospect for economic, let alone political solutions, and expect them to be quiet. They will go crazy, and they have. They have resorted as a very natural outcome of their living circumstances. So when we talk about the transition, the powers to be who are going to be shaping this thing have to factor in how do we improve the level of lifestyle of the Palestinians as far as in both the West Bank and Gaza, in order to make them less hospitable to terrorism, which is a process of capturing their minds. There is a process of capturing the minds of the victims and making them feel victimized, so their violence is a redressing of an injustice rather than violence and killing people. There is much to be done.
The rationalization of their own violence.
So you have to think of, how do we, and this will need external forces. I hate to say
it's going to need a lot of force
and time to improve education, to improve hospitals, to improve governance, to improve all of these things as a transition. You don't start with this. You don't start with a final status agreement. You start with preparing people, and this will have an impact on the Israelis. All they see right now is what they think is Palestinian terrorists. If they see somebody who looks like a Palestinian terrorist, they're afraid of him. That's what. So we need to adjust the living conditions of the Palestinians and make them less subject to this process of capturing their mind and turning into terror.
Of course, they were the single largest per capita recipients of foreign economic assistance for a very long time, and at the same time that violence arose. We can talk about the reasons why, and we can talk a lot about the outside exploitation of the Palestinian cause to encourage that violence for reasons that have nothing to do with the well-being of the Palestinian people. But certainly the Iranians have been very engaged in that aggressively and have no interest in the future of the Palestinian people. But this is a curse not for the Israelis, this is a curse for the Palestinians. The Israelis will manage. The Palestinians need to get out of this. If you look over the last 50 years, it seems in many ways this is a trap that has hurt them desperately. Okay, the hardest question of all, and this whole conversation is all hard questions. 50 years from now, you and I will both be extremely old.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody was wrong in 1967. Everybody said, yes, a few years, they'll take their territory, it'll sort out. Israel will go back to the Green Lines, Jerusalem, something complex. But where do you see it?
Nobody has an experience in the future, so let's be modest. But it depends on what we do. The decisions that are made here and now and next year, etc., will shape that future. That is the reason I'm always hesitant to say the Palestinians think this or the Israelis think this. It's just a meaningless generalization, because many thoughts within the Palestinians, and if we are able to link up lawful people, educated people, secular people who forward look to life, determines the way they live and their children are reared. If we interlink at that level and empower the people who want to live like the Palestinians, like the Italians live in Italy,
or even better.
Or I'll settle for Italy. It's fun. But That mindset needs to be interlinked and needs to be empowered.
Are you an optimist about it?
I have seen too many setbacks on my own path the last 15 years to be optimist. But I'm optimistic in the sense that no people can be misled forever, or no abnormal condition like the ones they live under right now can last forever. Things will give eventually. And
a cautious optimism then.
Cautious, guarded.
Guarded, but better than pessimism.
Pessimism is useless anyway. But
that is a wise and philosophical statement. And with that, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm delighted you were willing to join us.
Thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it too.
So, folks, that's the end of our conversation with Ziad Asali. Thank you for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint, and be sure to check out the rest of our videos and research from AEI.